Andrew, thank you. I see there's already some comments in the chats too. Everybody's saying hello. Everybody's saying nice background, Michael. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to a really exciting Swann Salon. When we catalog rare and important travel posters, we sometimes come across some very obscure and very interesting American rail images. And for the last 10 or 15, even longer number of years, whenever I come across a poster that bespeaks something extra special that I can't understand, there is only one person in this world who I will call to ask for questions, and that's Michael Zega. He is my go-to person for American historical train knowledge, and his knowledge is extensive. Not only has he written the book Travel by Train, which those of you who know the book will recognize it as one of the most serious and well-written books about posters. And books about posters usually have a lot of pretty pictures and they're very nice. And they say, this is a poster of the beach and this is a poster of the mountains. Michael's book on American railway advertising is an in-depth study of the entire field, and it's magnificent. I would highly recommend it to any of you who don't have it already. And it's also important for me to tell you that Michael doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. Just by way of a short biographical note, when Michael graduated Columbia University, he spent 3 years working as a sleeping car attendant on Amtrak. He is Mr. Train through and through. I'm sorry, I never cleared that with you. You'll probably hate that I call you that, Mr. Train.
That's good.
He has gone the extra mile this evening, and he has decorated his bedroom he's transformed it into the Century Club. In honor of the 20th Century Limited. He's the only person in the world who I know who sleeps under the image of a train. He was with Jackie Onassis, you'll have to tell that story, I don't remember, riding the train to Washington to protest the destruction of, was it Penn Station?
Grand Central.
Grand Central Station, to save Grand Central Station. He was also in Grand Central Station in 2013 for the 100th anniversary of Grand Central Station, where he was photographed riding on the 20th Century Limited, the train depicted behind him. This is all by way of saying Michael lives, eats, and breathes trains. He is a wonderful, wonderful raconteur. I'm delighted to consider him a friend. He's a colleague. I can't tell any more about him, so I'm going to say, Michael, welcome. Thank you so much for sharing tonight with us and all of our viewers. Why don't you start? I know before we get to the actual slideshow, you have one thing you want to share with us, which I think is fantastic.
So, good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. You know, these are kind of difficult times, and sometimes they get a little rattled. But we've got a great story to tell. I want to really talk first a little bit about myself. And then I want to show you a few images that I think resound to what's going on in the world directly, that really feel to my heart. And then we're going to talk a little bit about railroad poster history and railroad history. We'll talk about graphic design, railroad history, and American history. So I was going to start with the little boy on the train platform in Trenton, New Jersey. I was born in 1955. I'm 65 years old. And when I was like 8 to 12 years old, I used to stand on the platform in Trenton because my mom would go to New York for the day to shop, and we'd come to pick her up in the evening. She'd get the 6:30 train out of Penn Station. It was called the Mount Vernon, and it carried sleeping cars down to the Virginias, White Sulphur Springs, and things like that. But before I go further on that, today or yesterday in the mail, I received a booklet. This is an auction booklet. I'm just going to hold it up just for your entertainment. This is Railroad Relics, Artifacts, Rare and Historic Documents. It was the entire collection of the Pennsylvania Railroad Historical Collection, which was auctioned off in March 1972. I was 17. I didn't go to that auction, but the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central Railroad, the Santa Fe, the Union Pacific, all amassed incredible historical collections. And as the railroads declined, this auction was the result of the bankruptcy of the Penn Central. The New York Central put all of its archives on microfilm in 1958. They thought it was this really cutting edge technology. But microfilm 1950 isn't much good. Most of that's at the New York Public Library. So, you know, when we talk about posters, we think of archives. And when I started this back in the 90s, I've always been interested, but I really began in the 90s. It was really hard to find a railroad poster, you know, an American railroad poster. So with that, off we go. First slide, sir.
I didn't even have to stop you for time there, Michael. That's fantastic. Hold on.
So,
all right, here we go.
So there we go. Okay. So I would stand on the platform, you know, with my dad. And so I don't know, I have many stories, but I'm gonna, you know, the Pennsylvania Railroad and railroads generally in the 1960s were basically sort of at the end of the line. It was pretty dusty. Trenton, as I hope you know, is you know, on the main line to Washington. What we call the Acela Corridor, that was the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania and the New York Central both ran to Chicago, St. Louis, really covered the Midwest, as did any number of railroads. And, you know, today we talk about the Rust Belt and all that with politics. Basically, that was the heartland of America. And these were the companies that you know, served both the passengers and carried the freight. And basically the travel from the East Coast cities, Washington up to Boston and over to Chicago and the Midwest, was basically the heaviest corridor of travel in the United States. So there was intense competition. And as a little boy, there was a poster that hung up in the Trenton station. This is a much more beautiful example. This is by Milton Manasco. This is really from the late 1940s when they put on transcontinental sleeping cars. One of the things I'd also like to point out is that, you know, we're talking about travel posters, but basically every poster you're going to see is targeted at first class travel, which was maybe 10% of the total travel. You know, like ocean liners, the upper crust had the upper crust, and it was all the immigrants and the coach passengers and everything that kept the railroad going. So, so that poster, whoops, sorry, inspired me. And the other thing is that when you went down the stairs to the platform, it said to Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and points west. And as a boy, points west always got next.
Ready for the next slide? Is that
yes?
Okay.
Yes, sir. So my mom would catch the 6:30. At 6 o'clock, a train called the Broadway Limited, which competed with the 20th century, left New York. They both left at 6. They both got to Chicago at 9 in the morning. And if we got to the station early enough, we'd get to see the Broadway Limited roll through Trenton. And as I said, it was really a pretty rugged place, but the Broadway, if I can find the train, was this beautiful Tuscan red. Mm-hmm. This is just a car that I had. Everything matched. It shone as it went into the, you know, into the distance. And for a boy who was fascinated with trains, it just very much resounded. It's funny, a couple of weeks ago, somebody sent me a link. There's a wonderful airport site. And it was, there are a bunch of images of the Pan Am Worldport, which was completed in the early 60s. And it's just this astonishingly beautiful thing. And it's got a whole bunch of beautiful, pristine Pan Am 707s, not 747s, 707s, you know, parked around it. 1968 was also the movie Bullet with Steve McQueen, that race car movie in San Francisco. But he races at night on the runway, and he's running through Pan Am 707s. And the reason I mention this is that, I was the kid who was interested in something years before me. Most kids would have been interested in, of course, Pan Am. So I'm a little bit out of sync with my generation. Next, sir.
By the way, Michael, you say that like it's a bad thing, but it's not a bad thing at all. It's fantastic. And
Well, that's probably my father's voice.
well, maybe, but if from the voice of enthusiasts about posters and advertising, you just fit right in so perfectly. It's extraordinary. Hang on, next slide.
So now we're going to talk about a few that resound. I remember finding this in black and white because the New York Central, this is 1926, California Americans Vacation Land by John Brubaker, who was a Californian. This is the second in the New York Central's poster series of the 1920s. And New York Central was one of the great American advertisers, and I don't have time to go into that. It speaks for itself. And the reason I've got it up is that, think about it. You open the paper. I didn't open the paper today because I needed to be here for this, but that west of myth and the railroad had such an important role in creating the American myth. That west of myth, those California hills. I remember the first time I was there as a boy, I took the train from San Francisco during the day. It runs all the way down to Los Angeles, and climbing the hills at Salinas on the coastal range. And then coming down to the ocean lower down at San Luis Obispo, the train does these huge spiraling horseshoe curves as it goes down to the ocean. It's a remarkable ride. And there are those hills, and I've always remembered those hills, and now we live in the world we live in. So that's that one. Next, sir.
Wait, I actually have a question about this one, if you don't mind. And it's a question, I mean, just to prove to everybody that you know all of the esoteria that the rest of us laymen wish we knew. You said that this is the second poster that the New York Central line printed in the 1920s. So it was the beginning of their campaign, advertising the New York Central. But I don't believe that the New York Central rails ran all the way to California.
No, like I said, they stopped at Chicago and St. Louis. But if you plastered the posters all over the New York Central system and in American Express offices and whatnot, given that basically during the railroad era, the population density of America was really in the Northeast, that speaks to that's the answer.
I mean, it's pretty progressive advertising that for their second poster ever, they would advertise a destination that they didn't even go to. I mean, that's a moonshot. That's great.
Yeah, they were advertising California back in the 1890s. The thing is, and I was going to talk about it later, but with the early things, basically the railroads. Well, I'll wait.
Okay, wait.
I'll wait.
Let me move on to the next one for you.
Yeah. So, I live on 19th and 5th Avenue. And when I walk up to Midtown now, it's like walking into, to Mars most times. And again, I don't know, I'm a New Yorker. And this actually kind of makes me a little sad. It's a beautiful poster. This was 1930, 1929. This is Chelsea Bonesteel, who is he did science fiction images, but I, for years, had a meeting at 6 o'clock sharp on Park Avenue, and I would sit by the fountains in the Seagram building there and watch the twilight, looking at the New York Central building. And this really talks to my mind. It so captures that scene. And most American railroaders, like most American advertisers, they had this thing about realism. And what's wonderful about this poster is that, yes, there's realistic depiction, but there's also that essence of the sky and the way that building just hangs there. The New York Central was so proud of this building. The Grand Central was opened in 1913. This is now 1930, and this is the final building in Terminal City. All of those acres and acres of land rights. Everything you see there is on steel. There's hundreds of railroad tracks underneath. You know, we forget what's there. And that
We lost you there for a second, Michael. You seem to have...
urban development.
Oh, you're back now.
Okay.
You're good.
It says my connection is unstable.
Sounds stable enough. Carry on.
Okay, sorry. So anyway, I lost my train.
You're talking about the hundreds of train tracks and all the steel.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's just that, you know, everything's empty right now. And so this was the end of a vast project. And, you know, there are similar projects in other cities, but we find ourselves again in this time and place where it's possible that for the next 10, 20 years, we're going to have to rediscover a whole nother use for this that was created and finished, you know, in 1930. And then, of course, you know, rebuilt. But so again, it's beautiful, and it talks to unanticipated change that we're going through.
It's also interesting, you say that we tend to forget what's under Terminal City. Frankly, a lot of us never knew. I mean, a born and raised New Yorker, I'm not sure I ever realized how many square acres Grand Central covered, nor how many tracks were there, but it makes sense that all of these buildings were built over the tracks, and that area called Terminal City was all developed by the New York Central. I mean, this is just great sort of New York history that isn't that obvious to people who aren't, forgive the term, train obsessed.
So let me quote also, this is going to pertain to later, but there's an American writer, William Dean Howells, great 19th century writer. And in one of his novels, it's A Hazard of New Fortune. It's set in Manhattan, and it's basically about the publishing industry, the advertising industry, and new money. And there's a scene in there where a couple is, this was written in 1890, which is really the advent of the long distance train. We'll get into that, but the couple is strolling across town at twilight, and Howells writes that they quote, looked down upon the great night trains lying below, which would soon be hurling themselves north and east and west through the night. And that's, Howells is describing this couple basically where we're standing looking at this poster on an elevated bridge over a railroad yard. And what's also fascinating about that is, again, you know, we think of America as an automobile society, but there was a time when that thing, when the coming of the overnight limited in the 1880s and the 1890s, when the railroad network really became a network that you could travel crisscross the country, it was such a powerful American, and it was an American drama. It was so owned by Americans, and it was very different than that which was created in Europe, because of course here, anything basically west of the Alleghenies was open space, and it was really the railroads. They got to Chicago in 1850, and then we know the rest of the transcontinental. Next slide. So we have Grand Central by Earl Hoarder. And you know, when I first saw this, again, I knew it in black and white, and when I first found it in color, the original, I was really disappointed. I wanted something brighter and more dramatic. And it's funny how you learn over time, because Grand Central, it's not a brilliant space. It's a brilliant space from the aspect of design. And I think, you know, Hoarder, who was just a wonderful etcher, what he really captures is that the quality of light that kind of filters in from above. And also, you know, when you stand in Grand Central, there's just this little bit of noise, but it's essentially quiet. And there's this really, it's almost choreographed, the way people move across that space. It's just such a calming place. And Hoarder's image really, it does what it's supposed to do. The other thing I'd mention, since we got so many poster people, there where the Apple store is now, the east balcony, you see a train if you look closely. To the left of the poster, you can see a locomotive with a smokestack. And that was the DeWitt Clinton, which was one of the first American trains that ran from Albany to Schenectady back in the 1850s. It was part of the New York Central Historical Collection, which of course is gone. And the Central used that area for displays. And one of the things that I was talking to Nico about is that, so Leslie Reagan started painting posters for the Pennsylvania. He did a couple for the Pennsylvania, but anyway, for the New York Central in the early 30s. And I don't know, we know many of those images, but early on in Reagan's tenure with the New York Central, they held a poster exhibit up there of about 40 of his posters. And one of these days, I'm going to find if one exists, the list of what those posters were, because believe you me, all those poster people out there, there are still tens, and I can show you black and whites of Reagan's, from early on. There's a Leslie Reagan that I have a dining car menu of. It's menu cover. It's 2 colors printed in yellow and green, basically the same scene. But the original poster would be very different. So we need to keep on.
I want to reinforce what you just said, because when you told me that, I was stunned, and I get so excited learning things that I haven't known before or didn't know, and that was a real eye-opener. That in the late 1920s, early 1930s, Grand Central Station held an exhibition of the poster work of Leslie Reagan, and he had some 40 some odd posters in that exhibition. 40 posters by Leslie Reagan.
Numerous posters.
All right. The point is, we only know about 7 or 8 that he did. I mean, if I had to name them now.
15.
All right. You know 8 in black and white, and I know 7 in color. But the point is, what just blew my mind was that there was this exhibition for which there may not even have been a catalog. I think if there was one, you might have found it by now.
I think there is.
And
when I find
unlikely that catalog is illustrated, so at best it would probably just have the titles.
Yeah.
And it's indicative to me of this still lost world of graphic travel art that doesn't exist in the mainstream. And it would be wonderful if anybody is listening has any information on this Leslie Reagan exhibition at Grand Central Station, please share it with us.
Yes.
I would also add, Michael, just as an architectural note, staring now at the east balcony, which is where the Apple store is, eagle-eyed viewers will realize that there is no stairway going up there.
No.
Right now, there's a big stairway going up that mirrors the stairway on the west balcony. Unbeknownst to myself until I did research a few months ago, that second staircase going up to what is now the Apple store was not put into Grand Central until the 1990s.
Yeah.
They added it when the station was being redone in the 1990s. So it's a very recent addition, which I just didn't know. I thought that was another great fact.
So if you permit me one story about Grand Central. So, the boy on the platform, he would also take the train to New York in the 60s and walk through the ruins, the demolition of Pennsylvania Station. Literally, I remember tarps and sky and noise. And my dad went to Columbia, and he would take us in on Saturdays, and we'd go to a restaurant up the escalator there, at the head of the escalator in the Pan Am building. It was called Charlie Brown's. And it was a steakhouse, and we'd go early because we were kids, so Saturday night. My dad would take us downstairs to walk behind the gates, and the 20th Century Limited left at 6 o'clock. And one Saturday in December of 1967, my dad took us down there, and totally by happenstance, it was December 3rd or Saturday, December 2nd. it was the last run of the 20th Century Limited. We stumbled on the last run of the 20th Century Limited. So that's Grand Central.
That's amazing. You know, the other thing, it may not be the 20th Century Limited, but throughout Swann's business, we also have an autograph department. And several times that I can recall in the past 20 or so years, we've had autograph books that were put together by kids who waited on the platform at Chicago for either the chief or the 20th Century Limited to come rolling in, and they would get the stars and celebrities coming off the train to sign their autograph book. I sort of see you as one of those kids. I cannot tell a lie.
Hey, Nico,
Yeah?
before we move on, can you tell me what year that Leslie Reagan exhibition was again?
Frankly, I don't remember. I
Okay.
could find out, but I believe it was probably like 36, 35.
Awesome.
Somewhere
Thank
in there. Yeah.
Thanks. You ready for the next slide, Michael?
Yes, sir.
All right, we're going back into history now.
Yes, yes. So I'm going to start with unintended consequences. This is from the Harvard Business Library. I've never seen this one in person, but it just, again, it talks to a time and place. And like I said, 1880s, that decade of the 1880s is when the railroad really became a network where you could really begin to travel. And with the network came competition. And with competition, you had to, define your brand. And one of the first industries to really build brands and create logos, names, brand names, is the railroad industry. And the Burlington route is oftentimes mentioned as the first. This is actually a calendar. If you look, I thought that this was a poster, but in really looking at it, and this is small, this is not a a full sheet poster, like single sheet poster like the earlier ones. Basically, in the 19th century, the railroads used posters, they used brochures, but they were all displayed in ticket offices because basically the network had a station every 10 or 15 miles. They all had display racks. So, they had a marketing infrastructure, as it were. But yeah, this was a calendar. You can see actually where below the flower arrangements where the calendar pages were. And I do know that there are other examples, though, where they've actually printed flowers, and then on the back, they actually had the explanation of what flowers or plants those were and where the seeds would grow, because basically they're trying to develop, the traffic along the line. The Burlington was one of 3 or 4 railroads that really competed intensely across the Midwest, basically the prairies from Denver east to Chicago. And if you bear with me, the other railroad, which you're all going to see about, this is I can hold this up. This is a blotter. This is from 1883. It's also got a calendar on the back. This is the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, which is another extraordinary advertising company. And that was their first logo. So they're both competing. You can go to the next one if you would. So there's the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul. And if you just bear with me a second. That's by Ethel Reed. In Travel by Train, I was able to find from the Poster magazine a black and white of that. And this is 1896, really when the poster craze hit America. We had bicycle posters and magazine posters, and we had Penfield and all that. And the man who ran the advertising in the passenger department at the Milwaukee Road, his name was A.V.H. Carpenter, Alfred von Halen Carpenter. He was a retired doctor, or a doctor, an MD, who went into the the railroad business, because of course, you know, the railroad business in the 1880s and 1890s was basically like working in the digital business today. It was extremely cutting edge. So Carpenter really wanted to present his service. Again, this is up to Milwaukee, up to St. Paul, west to Kansas City, Omaha, as a line apart. And of course, using the female always, you know, as a effective, I've got something there. It's always, you know, it's a universally effective way of.
I'm going to jump in again, Michael, and do
yes.
my booster thing, which is just to bring to the poster world's attention. You said it. I'm just going to reiterate. This poster is by Ethel Reed.
Yeah.
Those of you poster people out there will know Ethel Reed's work for the small literary magazines that existed in the 1890s. Her output was not particularly large, but her work is generally very, very fine and eye-catching and graphic. And this is another one of those pieces that when you showed it to me, I was just like, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't know she did this. I can't believe it exists. To sort of reiterate what you said, it's in that sort of French style of almost the work of Jules Charest, where a pretty lady is being used to advertise a train, and the image has nothing to do with trains at all. It's just like, a pretty woman rides this train, you should ride this train. So it's amazing from a poster perspective, let alone a railroad perspective. It's an astounding image and so rare. As you were saying in your book, you only could find a black and white image. You've since found a color image. I've never seen this person in real life ever. I mean, it's so scarce.
So, you know, again, you know, in Europe, there was an infrastructure to display posters, but here they were sometimes plastered, you know, on construction sites and whatnot. But again, during the night, and this is really rare because this would have basically been a, you know, single sheet poster, but basically, and particularly railroads, you know, their work was smaller, and it was, you know, inside ticket offices, which makes this really rare. Carpenter also wrote a memoir in 1890, I'd point out. It's called The Life and Times of A.V.H. Carpenter, and he commissioned Will Bradley, a contemporary of Ethel Reed's, who also went on to become very prominent in the Midwest and, you know, in that art and illustration, that really generator of Chicago at the time. Chicago at the turn of the century was just, it was a remarkable place for young people exploring various aspects of graphic design. And the railroad, all of the railroads running out of Chicago, particularly the Santa Fe, you know, worked through the Art Institute and things like that to find young people. So I guess we'll go to the next one.
You bet.
This is my favorite. If ever there was a mixed up poster, perhaps this is it. But the Sunset Limited ran from New Orleans, it still runs today, ran from New Orleans to Los Angeles and San Francisco. It was inaugurated in 1894. And you see there on the right, that's the Tribune building on Newspaper Row down in Manhattan. Nico came across this. The Sunset Limited was this phenomenal little train, and there was a phenomenal advertising campaign behind it. For the first 3 years, that image of the train flying through the sky was on any number of things, and it was plastered on many, many posters across the Northeast. If you look at early volumes of Sunset magazine, which was created by the Southern Pacific to you know, promote California. Sunset's still published today. You can see many images in which that train flies across, as I say, flies across the western sky. The whole idea of the Sunset Limited was to move transcontinental travel down to the south where there's no snow, no cold. Again, this is the 1890s. Normally you went west from Chicago and you see prominently there the Rocky Mountains in wintertime. And basically that's the other thing that I would point out is that basically well into the early 20th century, these trains ran winter season only. California was a new escape. That's when Pasadena really became built and all that. So, and what's interesting is there in the bottom, that's the Hotel Del Monterey. The Del Monte was built in 1880, and it was the first of the great, it was built by the Southern Pacific. It was the first of the great Western resort hotels. Today, that's where Pebble Beach is. Pebble Beach is the grounds of the old Del Monte. So then the last thing I want to talk about is that, so the Sunset Limited ran once a week, carried 50, 60 passengers. It was a really big deal. The second season, it ran twice a week. The third season, 1896, it ran twice a week. In 1897, in New Orleans, there was an outbreak of yellow fever, of all things. It spread basically across that portion of the South, say south, up to Memphis, west into Texas, east into, east basically to like the Florida border. And that part, in the winter of 1897, that part of the United States was quarantined. The Sunset Limited stopped running. And they started in 1898, they routed it via Chicago, and then they started running it again. And it's, again, we live in this crazy world, and you talk about unintended consequences. The Sunset Limited, and basically that passenger travel on the Sunset route never really quite recovered. That Sunset route was the second transcontinental railroad. The other problem with it is that at New Orleans, to get to the Northeast, you had to cross the South. And today we talk about regions of America. Well, the railroad development in the Northeast was remarkable, but until well after the Civil War ended in 1865, getting across the South was really difficult by train. They ran first a train down to Florida in 1887 or so. It was the beginning of Flagler and his resort work. But basically, it took until the 1890s for the Southern Pacific. This was the Huntington of the Huntington Library and the Big Four, Stanford at the university. It took these guys who could basically do anything. It took them well into the 1890s to get some kind of a connection up to the Northeast, which of course is where they wanted to, that was where the traffic comes from. So the world is really an unpredictable place, even in poster advertising.
And, from an aesthetic point of view, everyone will notice, but I'm just going to point out that the train is literally going from the freezing cold Northeast to the bright, sunny, flowery West Coast. A wonderful image. This is one of the images that when we got it at Swann many years ago, Michael was the first and only person I called, and together we worked out exactly what it was, the history behind it, and what it was trying to represent. Just amazing.
Yeah, it's a cool thing.
I have a quick poster appreciation question, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
We had a comment in the chat about untrimmed poster, color bars and all. And I was wondering if that kind of is a feature in a poster like this. Is that like of interest to a poster collector, or is it like a certain type of collector that's going to value those kinds of things?
I would say, from my years in advertising, it's a proof.
And I would say that if a poster collector wanted to have this poster without the color bars, they might be in big trouble because I've never seen it any other time. So
yeah, this is like rarer than
without
rare.
the color bars, forget about it.
So buy it when you get it, is what you're saying.
Really?
We don't know, Michael, that this was actually produced as a poster, do we? It may have just been a proof.
Well, the thing is again, in the digital world, you can go online and look at Sunset Magazine from 1898. and which is really when it began. And there are pages, literally there's a big article about this. And, you know, there are, I don't know, a dozen examples of various Sunset Limited executions, you know, examples of posters. So if anyone's really interested, that's what I would recommend. I know myself that you know, the other one that's really famous is it's famed around the world, and that train is literally circumnavigating the globe. You know, they like to make it fly. And the next slide will tell you why they like to make it fly. So this is on the competition. This is the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. This is a photograph by William Henry Jackson, 1898. And to my mind, this is the California Limited, which was the prestige train. Again, this is the first class train that in 1898 ran twice a week from Chicago to California, to Los Angeles. This is how you got to the Hotel Green and all the great hotels of Pasadena. And that series of buildings there, whatever, to the left, this is the Pueblo of Laguna. And so the Sunset Limited flew across the sky, and again, the railroad competition, and trying to differentiate, you know, the various lines. The Santa Fe, of course, at this time, literally in the year 1898, set upon the idea of using Native American images, artifacts. You know, today we would say rightfully that the Santa Fe basically appropriated Pueblo culture to sell railroad travel. The Santa Fe had an enormous impact on architecture, design, American culture. We'll talk more about that, but you know, from 1898 through the beginning, the 1920s, that first great wave of California migration, the overwhelming share of it went down these tracks, went west, past Santa Fe, past the Grand Canyon. This really became, you know, the railroad line of Western myth. I guess we can go further.
Great.
So, Nico's smiling face is over part of this, but this is the Pennsylvania-New York short line, and I'm gonna have to look one second. This is 1903, and you know, the reason I put this up, this is a car cart. And the Pennsylvania, again, they were competing with the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania was this really engineering driven, almost military organization. And this image really talks to another way to gain attention. If the slogan that the railroad used for many, many years was "look at the map," and the little girl in the foreground reading the book, it actually says, "look at the map." They often threw a map. And of course, the little children are the characters. They're the major cities: New York, Philadelphia. The little girl reading is Washington, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago. The train obviously is a little faded over time. And you know, at the time, there were two women in Philadelphia. One of them was Jessie Wilcox Smith. The other one was Elizabeth Shippen Green, who really were creating images like this. Like many railroad posters, there's no signature on this. And that's the other thing, you know, when we talk about posters as collectors, we say, oh, that's a Leslie Reagan, or that's a Sasha Maurer, or boy, I wonder who this is by. And oftentimes, you know, there was an art director, there was an artist. The railroads really basically invented advertising in the 1870s and 80s when men like J. Walter Thompson and N.W. Ayer were beginning the business. You know, that's when railroads started the business. So there was this whole infrastructure, and it was oftentimes a shared responsibility. Just a little story, the man behind this, you know, the railroad man behind this, his name was Elias Allen. Excuse me, Elias Allen Ford, excuse me, that's my, whatever. And Ford fought in the Civil War, as did many of the railroaders. He was shot through the lung in 1862 at the Battle of Stone River. And he survived, went on to run the Pennsylvania's, some of his passenger and advertising until he had to retire at age 70. And he retired out to Pasadena. He had a Green and Green, the company, the firm that was building beautiful green cottage, and talks to, you know, the understanding of design and just how the crossover of all this. I guess we'll go to the next one, sir. So in Santa Fe, so poster's supposed to gain attention. You're supposed to be able to glance at it. And this is by a young man named Louis Treviso. How are we doing for time?
We're doing okay, but if you went a little faster, it wouldn't hurt anybody.
Okay.
Speed up that locomotive.
So I could go on about Treviso. Treviso was born in 1887. He lived to be 40 years old. He died in 1928. His mom was Mexican. His dad was Italian. He invented what we call the Santa Fe poster style. And the elements are basically, it could be the Grand Canyon. It could be a sunset. It could be any kind of an image, but it's basically very colorful and abstracted. And that Santa Fe logo, that's the Santa Fe is the Holy Cross and the circle is the wheel. The Santa Fe logo floated. This is basically like 1912, really before World War I, when, you know, they were doing all that adventurous work in Europe. Treviso was also very famous for his hand lettering. He was really more an art director than an artist. And since I have to speed it up, what I find really fascinating about this is that the design. It's like Maynard Dixon or other Western artists, you know, the Indian with his blanket. But if you look at it again, you blink, it could also be basically a Plains Indian war bonnet, right? So it's just fascinating. Treviso was, well, he was a prominent art director, and I guess we should just move on. So now we're into the 1920s, and I wanted, you know, when we talk about railroads, we often talk about the golden age of the railroad, and people say the 20s and the 30s, but by then the railroad was very much in decline. So this is the Southern Pacific, which again went across the South, the border, but also connected, you know, at Ogden to the west and then along the Pacific coast. And they're selling dining car service here. This is by Fred Ludekins. This is the mid-20s, I would expect. And basically, I love this because it really talks to the essence of the dining car. It's such a delicate yet dynamic image. And the level of detail, look at the color on at the base, at the tail of the tablecloth. The SB and many railroads had special linens, and they're having salad from the salad bowl. Oftentimes dining cars back in the day, they had a large communal salad bowl, which you know was brought to the table and you took a portion from. You didn't use your spoon, but you know, and things were a little different then, but the salad bowl was, you know, on both the Southern Pacific and the Baltimore and Ohio was a very prominent marketing device. And for me, I have to say, having worked on the railroad all those years, the one story that really resounds is that the men who made all this possible aren't in the picture. You know, basically they hired, Pullman ran the first dining car in 1868, and they hired black men. Many of them were slaves. And basically, you know, black men served on railroads till the era of Amtrak, and you rarely see them. And the reason I mention that is that for me, when I worked on the railroad, there were two men, Mr. Norman and Mr. Moses. I was this kid, you know, right out of college, and I loved trains. And these men had hired on back in the 30s. They knew everything you could know about a sleeping car. And they saw this kid who loved trains. They went so out of their way to show me, to explain, to, you know, just to tell me about their lives and the beauty of service. And by that, I mean, you know, the element of taking care of people. So yeah, you know, given what's going on today, it's a powerful thing.
I'm going to throw in a few of my own sense here. First of which is this poster came up for sale at Swann a number of years ago. The client of ours who purchased it is watching tonight and is very, very excited. I just got a very enthusiastic text message from them. But from my point of view, Michael, as far as you're concerned, I called you when we got this poster in to help me catalog it. And the fact that you were able to delineate or explain to me how the different railways had their different printed colored tablecloths, and that you could see the end of this tablecloth sticking out from under the white tablecloth was just an extraordinary tidbit of information. Not only that, but the idea of a communal salad bowl, like from a history of eating point of view and a history of dining out points of view, that's an amazing concept that I had never realized got such a big national push from the railroads themselves. So this is just an extraordinary poster on so many levels.
The other thing that I just would throw in also is that, again, you know, this is America, not Europe. It was the wilderness, as it were, and the dining car. Many Americans' first experience of formal meals, wow, formal service, you know, was in a dining car. And
that's incredible.
They learned, you know, from the staff. And the staff was very accommodating.
Nice. Let's go on to the next image, shall we?
So this is the back end of that train with the dining car. The San Francisco Overland went over the overland route, the first transcontinental railroad. The rest of it was the money train to San Francisco. This is from the 1920s, late. When I was a little boy, my dad bought me lots of books by Lucius Beebe, who wrote about railroads. He wrote about cafe society here in New York in, you know, the 30s and the 40s, but he was a railroad guy and he knew all about design and history. And he reproduced this thing in black and white. And for years, I've wanted to find it. And so I throw this in. This is also by Fred Ludekins. And it really does talk to that, you know, that which happens on the rear platform of a train. But I have to say, when I did find it, it was kind of a disappointment because I wanted Technicolor and I got, you know, a very proper palette. So, but I guess an aristocrat is, you know, proper. Anyway, nice little
connection with nice the palette here and the palette with Hoarder's view of Grand Central. It's the same palette.
Yes, indeed. But they're going across, you know, the magnificent landscape. Anyway.
Shall we go to the next one?
Yeah. So now we have Hernando Villa in the chief in the Santa Fe. And so we've gone from Treviso before World War II. Now we're basically in 1930 and we have an Art Deco chief. Hernando Villa was, you know, Hispanic. Grew up in Los Angeles at the turn of the century, found his way, you know, to the Santa Fe. They sent him out to Taos and Santa Fe and the rest of it. But by the time we got to the 1930s, the imagery had become really much more stylized, you know, this deco imagery. And I guess, you know, a year ago, I was out in New Mexico. I gave a talk about actually Louis Treviso out at a railroad meeting in Santa Fe. And we went to Gallup, New Mexico, where there's an old hotel called El Rancho, where all the movie stars went. And this really talks to that. You know, the Santa Fe, they basically bust, or not bust, but they put on the train all the John Ford, which of course was a few years after this, but during the silent film era of the 20s, everybody came out to Gallup and Winslow, and they filmed Westerns. And so this, I don't know, to me, this really talks to that age where, you know, people are movie stars and all those entertainers are coming east and west and making movies. And
I think, did
yeah.
she ran from Chicago to Los Angeles? Is that right?
Yes. Fascinating is that by this point, they just assumed that everybody knew where the chief went. It would become part of American culture.
Yeah, I think I bring that up. I think it was the chief that these young boys would go to meet as it rolled into Chicago to get the movie stars coming off from Los Angeles.
Yeah.
That makes sense in my mind.
And when I go to New Mexico, I still take the train. It goes over that same line and actually over the mountains through New Mexico. It's one of the most remarkable pieces of railroad, you know, in terms of scenery and engineering that you'd ever want to see. Sir?
You got it.
So we're in the streamline era. And I was telling you early on about those mountains at Salinas. Well, that train was the Daylight that ran. And this is in 1937 when they streamlined the Daylight. It was one of the first streamlined trains. And from the post, I want to talk to poster, artist ID. A number of people, I say that this is by Sam Hyde Harris. Other people say it's by this person, that person. But again, there's no name on here. And back when the Southern Pacific was creating these things or producing these things, there were any number of artists involved. There was a Californian by the name of Paul Carey. There was Sam Hyde Harris. There was Haynes Hall. There was Ludekins. They all worked for the Southern Pacific, and oftentimes they collaborated. And so what I find interesting about this, and you know, I've got that 20th century on the wall behind me, is that with streamlining, the best posters just took it down to the essence. And the color scheme of the train was much planned. It was to evoke California with the red roofs and you know, I can't remember what the orange stood for at this point, but they advertised it for years as the most beautiful train in the world. The sad thing about the streamlined trains, though, is that, so this is 1937. And when, you know, I was talking about early on, that couple crossing the railroad tracks in 1890 and looking at the great trains about to set off and all the excitement of it. World War II came just a few years later. In the spring of 1942, railroad service just changed so dramatically that you know, these trains, which just resonate so, were a dot in history. You know, there were many streamlined trains afterwards, but the very early on, the remarkable designs were very short-lived. Sir. So this is, I'm going to finish with the 20th Century Limited. And this is an image, this is an editorial image. This is not an advertisement. This is from Vogue from 1938, the streamlined century that was streamlined by Henry Dreyfuss. Is pictured. And I put this up again because I want to talk just a bit about, again, you know, the place that railroads and actually, you know, this particular train had in American in the American mind. Condé Nast moved, the company moved into the Gray Bar building in 1927, right? You know, it's the eastern entrance of Grand Central. You walk through it from Lexington. And when they did, they wrote that they thought now that the editor was going to be much more prominent because he was all of 200 feet from the locomotive of the 20th Century Limited. Condé Nast himself was still alive when he died a few years later. But Condé Nast, when he was a very young man, knew very well George Daniels and the other men who promoted the New York Central and were, you know, really remarkable advertising men. So there's an awful lot of crossover. What I find really extraordinary also about this image is this is also the advent in, color photography really appearing in things like magazines. A few years before, this really wasn't possible. And what's doubly fascinating is when you look at the fin, right, or the headlight, that's actually aluminum. It's not painted. The rest of the train is painted. And this was Vogue's fall fashion magazine. And, you know, by this time we were in the Depression and the magazine Vanity Fair had disappeared a few years ago. It was basically integrated into Vogue. And there's a little caption there at the bottom. I call this the lady in the locomotive. The caption reads, "The locomotive wears a new aluminum hood by Henry Dreyfuss. The lady wears a new Himalayan marten jacket, a wool dress, and they're both by Jackal, Jackel. So this is by Toni Frazelle. She was I don't know, at this point she was about 30 years old, but she was a very dynamic young photographer. She was really known for action photography. She shot people in airplanes and cars. She later did a really cool story on Mount Tremblant that has many of the similar colors to this, and that saturated sky, she liked that. But yeah, if ever there was an image that speaks to the time and the place and the streamliner, and of course, again, you know, within a few years, the war would so change the 20th century that's where we are. So the last of the talk, sir.
We have two more after this, Michael. You may have forgotten.
Yes, we've got the others, but yeah. So I want to finish with this. Everybody knows what this is now, and you can see behind me there. Yes, this is, the Henry Dreyfuss's 20th Century Limited. And again, you know, the crossover. Henry Dreyfuss started out as a stage designer in New York. And the man who ran the New York Central, F.E. Williamson, he and his wife were, at the time, they loved the theater. I don't know how Henry Dreyfuss met them or they met Henry Dreyfuss, but Henry Dreyfuss, of course, was a longtime client of the New York Central was a longtime client of Henry Dreyfuss. The Broadway Limited that I showed you at the beginning, their Pennsylvania's trains were designed by Raymond Loewy for years. Raymond Loewy, I guess, is perhaps most famous now because Donald Trump wants to change his paint scheme of the presidential airplane. Anyway, I think that's, I could go on about this, but I think we're running low on time, and there are a couple more that we want to talk about that are in the show itself, right, Nico?
Well, actually, this next one isn't in the show. We had this up for sale recently, but I know you love Phoebe Snow and you wanted to talk.
I thought this was in the show.
I think we had
this isn't, no, but this is in the auction, yes?
Not, Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't believe they are.
Lauren says yes, it is.
Yes.
Thank you, Michael, for correcting me. Thank you, Lauren. I'm going to stand corrected here.
So,
it's so dark you can't see me blush.
So we were talking again about all those railroads crisscrossing the Northeast. And the Lackawanna, which went from Hoboken, you can see it, it's still right there, you know, the terminal with the tower, you see it in the center image, went up to Buffalo. Everybody, you know, why would they, what is it about Buffalo? But Buffalo back at that time was the Pan Am exhibition. It was also the 5th largest city in the United States. You know, that part of the world was really important. And Lackawanna burned anthracite, which burned clean. Riding a train was filthy, even the 20th century, you know, until it was air conditioned. And again, you know, it's competition. You had to have your point of difference. And if you'll permit me, I have a couple images that predate those. This is like 1910 or so, but so before they had Phoebe Snow, they also had Mark Twain. This is an ad from, I think you can see it. That's like 1900. It's a magazine campaign. And Mark Twain is writing on his telegraph at SAM in white duck suit, and it is still white. Mark Twain. 1903. This, I hope, this is the first iteration of Phoebe Snow. She's there photographed on the platform at Hoboken. The building behind the locomotive still stands. And the original rhyme, I'm bad at this, and the rhyme was, of course, you know, to replicate the rhythm of the jointed rail. Rarely do we have jointed rail, but it's clickety-clack, clickety-clack. And it went, says, Phoebe Snow, about to go upon a trip to Buffalo. My gown stays white from morn till night upon the road of anthracite. And she became a national sensation. Basically, she remained a sensation and an advertising avatar through World War I. After World War I, of course, fashions changed so that a woman in a white dress like that just wouldn't cut it anymore. But what I find interesting of these, and these are all car cards, basically, the Lackawanna, like the London Underground really did a lot of that sort of advertising where they ran in trolleys and all that. But the center image, Pennsylvania Station was opened in 1910, the new Grand Central 1913. And this talks, I think, you know, to that. The shortest way. So then they're talking to Manhattanites, and you can read there, when Hudson sailed into New York Harbor, he was seeking the Northwest Passage, the shortest way to the west. The Lackawanna was also the shortest way to Buffalo. So if you'll permit me, if up the bay he came today and asked to learn the shortest way, each wise, polite Manhattanite would answer road of anthracite. There you have.
Wise, polite, and Manhattanite have not been used in the same sentence since this poster was published.
Truly. So I think we have another.
We actually have two more, which are in the sale. I stand corrected now. I was distracted here at home.
So before we were talking about the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul and Ethel Reed, and there's a map there on the bottom. By this time, this is the 1920s. They had built west to Seattle. They were the third railroad to go across the Northwest, and it basically didn't work out real well. But they built an electric locomotive, system to climb through the mountains. It was the first out there. And of course, it's smoother, cleaner, and whatnot. So during the 19-teens, in the 1920s, they were advertising that the electric power, the electric traction. And what I find fascinating about this is that it's a beautiful image, and it's got some, we determined it's Chinese writing, and I believe we translated it, and I was kind of hoping, okay, it's the 30s, maybe the 20s. The New York Central actually did ship posters around the world. There are images of New York Central posters in Cairo. an American Express ticket offices. So I was hoping that this was going to say, I don't know, something, about get your tickets at the Hong Kong office. But what it says is world's longest electrified railroad in Chinese, which is a selling advantage. It is a beautiful image too. That's the thing, that Milwaukee is another that basically for generations used or really created images that resounded. They talks to the palate of the Pacific Northwest, and it's much more, it's dramatic. So, Nico, you have anything to add to that?
It speaks to the immigration patterns, right? If they were playing to Chinese-speaking either citizens or immigrants, they were trying to get them to ride the railroad east, presumably.
Yeah.
All right, Michael, one more.
Yes.
One and done.
So I did a little, I don't know, I love this. This is neat. This is probably the Boston and Maine. That ran basically from Boston up through New Hampshire and into Maine. And if you can believe it, in the 1920s and 30s, there were about 6 or 7 trains a day from Boston to Montreal. A few of them ran overnight, a few of them ran during the day. And so apparently in the late 1920s, the Boston and Maine decided to create some posters. And this is one of a series that were done by, I have to look, his name is Charles W. Holmes. And there's one for a boat train. There's a couple that actually show a number of human images, faces and whatnot. And in many ways, those actually look like the work of John Held Jr., who's obviously much more famous. I've never really heard of Charles W. Holmes. It's a beautiful poster. The cross on the top of Mount Royal there dates to 1924. The light of the city there on the river, I think dates this poster much later. It's a beautiful image. The other thing from a dating standpoint is that I looked at various railroad timetables and things, and that car, the last car of the train there, if you'll notice, it's got arched windows, and that was a car that was still built out of wood. It was an observation car. It ran on the day train that the Boston and Maine ran from Boston to Montreal. So you could get a good look at the mountains. I think it actually went through Crawford's Notch in New Hampshire. And the two trains, the overnight train was named the Alouette, beautiful name, long gone. And the day train, which this pictures, was named the Ambassador. So kind of cool what you can figure out about a poster.
And that is why you, sir, are Michael Zega. Arched windows, wooden trains, date of the cross on the mountain. Those are things that never, ever would have occurred to me and are absolutely genius. Michael, thank you so very much. That was just great. And, even having run through this with you and talked to you about it for weeks and weeks, I still learned things that I didn't know, including stuff about that last poster, which I should add. I think Holmes did 6 posters for the Boston and Maine Railroad. This is the first time I've ever seen this one. The other 5 are rare, but at least known. This has, as we would say, previously unrecorded, and a great image. But also the fact that so many Americans had their first experience ever dining out on a dining car, just fascinating. I've always been interested in the history of food and the history of restaurants, and that plays right into it. Amazing. Thank you.
Go ahead. Go.
It occurs to me too, in all the excitement, you failed to show us the Mercury behind you.
Well, shall I?
Why not?
Go for it.
So
I'm going to pin your video so we can all see this.
Can you see that? Yes? Oh. How do I?
No, you're
there.
Great. We can see it.
So,
awesome.
That is super.
So it's not lit really well, but I would just say that what really makes this remarkable is that that was the first train that Dreyfus designed for the New York Central. That's 1936. And that charcoal drawing, that's actually that's the Dreyfus studio rendering of the, of the train. So yeah, that's really rare. It's one thing to have a designer do it, and it's another thing for it to go through the focus of artists and all that. So
yeah, I've never actually seen that one in person before. That's a very rare image, Michael. That's a great one.
I could go on and on and on. I honestly, there was so much detail that I really wanted to talk about, but if I could leave you folks with anything, again, that's that thing about how in America that the era of the long distance train from the 1880s through basically the 1920s so shaped our country. And we talk about Route 66 and California's auto, but so much of America in development was the railroad. So I'll leave you with that.
We do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
If you guys feel like we have a minute or two it's just a couple. And one of the things that came up in the chat was Laura said that the exhibition book might be available at the Special Collections Library in Michigan. Yeah. That's in the chat. And we had this other question in the Q&A about it was a person pointing out that the DeGloyer Library, SMU in Dallas, has a very large railroad collection. And I was wondering what other resources might be out there for folks who are just interested in, like, what are the best libraries, best places to look for information about the visual history of railroads?
Boy, that's a question. The DeGloyer's a wonderful library. There really isn't a particular library, like basically Western Americana collections, like Yale has a remarkable collection, the Newberry Library in Chicago, the Huntington Library, the California State Railroad Museum. Actually, that's a railroad museum in Sacramento that has a remarkable library. By and large, though, you really just have to look. The image behind me, I don't know that it's probably in a number of collections. That's Samuel Gott's show. And that was the big thing behind me was created for the Metropolitan Museum. They were going to do a Dreyfus collection, or exhibition. So it's that kind of thing where you just have to kind of look. But basically, most really important, well-known research libraries, most really good university research libraries have a few. It's not an easy thing.
Michael, I see one thing in the chat that's, it's not really a comment, but I'm going to turn it into a comment because I find it fascinating. There may not actually be an answer to this. But somebody pointed out on the salad bowl poster that only the man had a plate and the woman wasn't eating.
Yeah, I know. It's weird. I was going to get into all that. If you look at his spoon, I'm not even sure if that's a serving, anyway, a serving spoon, that's his spoon. It gets a little dicey there.
Okay. So we shouldn't read anything into the fact that the woman doesn't actually have a plate for the salad bowl?
No, because, you had to make the poster, work, right? Can't have everything.
Fair enough.
Elizabeth had a question about railroad union graphics, convention posters. Like, is there any tradition of railroad union graphics or
graphics
or ephemera? Union. So like.
Yeah. The employees. I was when I was a card carrying member. To my knowledge, no. I really can't think of any instance where, or I shouldn't say any, but it doesn't come to mind how what sort of ephemera would have been created that way. There are things like meetings for like the Grand Army of the Republic, even Confederate veterans, any number of groups, the railroads created menus and tour guides and any number of things for special movements. So if there was an employee trip or something, there could be something attached to it, but and I wouldn't know where there would be any sort of collection. I really would doubt that the unions kept anything like that, because the unions have, so been consolidated over the years too.
Thank you.
It's not much of an answer, but.
No, that's okay. So first of all, Michael, thank you again for joining us tonight. This has been like our best attended webinar salon so far. We're going to be continuing them all season long.
Michael, it was great. We'll be in touch. Thank you kindly, everybody. Thanks for tuning